we tend to look at the ministry as preaching to the multitudes from the pulpit and giving little time to training men, and that's a little bit lopsided.
This is Master Ministry, tips, tools, and truths to advance eternal effectiveness in ministry. I'm your host, Douglas Hammett. Let's move into the broadcast now.
What advice would you give to preachers who want to train men in their church? How they could go about that, or what advice would you just have off the cuff here for this?
Well, I think first of all, get the right mindset, understanding that this is how the Lord, while he preached to the multitudes, he invested his life in the 12 and the 70, and that we tend to look at the ministry as preaching to the multitudes from the pulpit and giving little time to training men, and that's a little bit lopsided. So having the right understanding of what you're doing is important, because it is very time consuming, and it's also very heartbreaking, because you're going to have failures and you're going to put a lot of time and effort into the lives of men only to be disappointed. But this we can look at even the Lord. There were those that went back and followed him no more, and there were those that betrayed him, and the same with Paul and so forth, that they had to endure that. But if you get the right perspective and teach the church the same thing, so that people understand that we're more than just holding services on a regular basis, but we're about the next generation. We're training to perpetuate what we have here today, whether it's in this church or in starting other churches, and we need manpower for that. Getting people on board is very important. Then try to get out of the Bible college mentality where there's a lot of things, and I've done this before, where you have application forms and references and handbooks, and all of those things really aren't necessary. Having a plan, however, is important, that you're going to look at the men that God's given you, and where do you start? Normally you would start with, well, you want to balance some book learning, doctrine, with practical on soul winning, or you usually wait for a while to start teaching them how to preach. You want to get some Bible into them first, but variety is good. And trying to do it all yourself is very difficult. And this, of course, I think is where having several men on staff, pastors and so forth in the church, can really lighten the load and share that, where you can all be teaching. But sometimes, depending on the men that God gives you, you have self-motivated ones that you can really work with on a faster basis, and others you might take a long time to actually train them. However it takes, everyone's different. Yeah. But I think you've got to have a plan, and you've got to think it through and tailor-make it to the individual men. What do they need right now in their life? They may be fairly strong if they've been in the church from their childhood and they've heard good sound preaching and they've received it. Their doctrine's going to be pretty straight, so you may not need to belabor that as much as if you would if with somebody who was a fairly young Christian. And they may be lacking skills in Bible exposition and study, areas like that. So you've got to know your men, and you've got to have a plan. I think that's the second thing.
Very good. One of the things I found in training men was I needed to be in touch with their lives, but because of time's sake sometimes because I felt like other men in ministry might have skills or knowledge that would be helpful to these men, as well as the variety in training them. What I ended up doing was setting up modules where I would bring a man in to teach for a week, and they get exposed to other ministries and viewpoints that can be very helpful. So I didn't feel like I had to do it all. Right. At the same time, I don't know there's a course in in our Bible Institute that we ran in the Bible College, because I was heading up that for several years, I never felt like there was a course I couldn't teach and do a good job.
Right.
But just having that extra perspective often.
I think, we found, and it's been quite a few years since we did this, we changed from teaching a course throughout the year to going to module. And while it's a little bit more intense for the teacher, and I suppose for the students to come out every night of 1 week, but it does get it over. And for our situation with men who are in the military, and they may be deployed for half the year, and therefore they can't do anything, but at least with a module you can get modules in. So that, I think, is helpful. Another thing we have done, I haven't done it for a while, but if we would have a visiting preacher or an evangelist or a missionary come in, we would try to set up a pit round table, and we would have the preacher come in, and the pits would have pre-written questions. And it wasn't a grill to try to trip him up or anything, but just to...
These aren't pit bulls, then?
No, they're not. Yeah, PIT is preacher in training.
There you go. Okay.
And but they would ask questions, and it was a little bit spontaneous after that, and just pick his brain. We found that was helpful. We gave the guest preacher an opportunity to say, speak for 30 minutes and just share his heart, whatever he wanted to convey to them as young men who are headed for the ministry, and then just open it up for questions. And some of the questions were, how long do you put into preparing a sermon? That was big on their minds because it was a struggle for them to put together a sermon. So they wanted to know practical things like that. But many times the questions were really good. And I remember on one occasion we had a young evangelist and we had an old preacher together, and it was a very interesting dynamic, but these men both had different experiences to share, and that's fine because I'm there, and it's not like I'm sending men off to be trained by others, but I'm getting all of that additional insight and experience and wisdom, because I don't have all the wisdom in the world, especially since I have to share it with you.
If a young man was asking you, as he's looking at his church training him, and he feels like, wow, this isn't as spectacular as a big university that has all the, the pizzazz and everything going, what would you say to that young man to encourage him or to direct him in his thinking at that point?
Well, I would certainly point out the Bible plan, which I think is very clear, both in example and in precept, and I would hope that he would accept that. I would also point out that we have a number of Bible colleges that actually buy our material to use in training their own students. So the level of our materials that we've produced and use is definitely at a college level. In fact, I've had some say it's beyond that for what the average college would give. I do not know that, but that's what has been said. So I would explain that, and I would also I would understand that this is a tradition, and as much as we don't like to admit it, Baptists have a lot of traditions, and a lot of them aren't really scriptural. And anything, it's got nothing to do with the motives or the heart of those that are involved in it. They're invariably good men, but anything that gets away from the Bible plan has within it the seeds of its own destruction. That's why you find colleges that in a generation are turning out liberals. They started off with well-meaning, good men who were sound in the faith, but there's just something about getting away from God's plan, and you've seen it, I've seen it. Not in every case, but I think inevitably that's going to be there.
I think almost every case.
Well,
opinion, maybe not yours, but
I'm being charitable.
Yeah, I'm not charitable. I'm sorry.
Well, I don't want to criticize because, I do realize that a lot of the preachers that I know and care about, they've received that training, and I don't. There was a time, perhaps 20 years ago, where I've always thought of preachers sometimes when they get together, they're kind of like dogs that want to sniff each other out. And there was a time where you would be asked, well, what college did you go to? And I know the feeling of where you feel very inferior because you have to say, well, I never went to Bible college. And then the pendulum swung the other way, where it became the in thing to be trained in your church. And then you could become quite proud about that. And so you've got to be careful not to allow superiority or pride to well up in your heart. But I would just, a young man, if he said, I think I should go off to Bible college, I would challenge him, and I would show him the scriptures, and again, it's kind of the culture in our church now that if a young man surrendered to preach, he would kind of know what the way to go is. It's been talked about enough and preached about enough that it would be rather odd, I'd expect, for someone to say that, unless he was looking for a wife.
Oh, now that might be a good reason, huh?
Yeah.
Maybe not a good one, but anyway.
Well, whatever.
Good in his eyes.
Yeah. But that's not been an issue for us. We've actually experienced.
Amen. Any further thoughts on just training men? That's something that maybe I haven't asked. It's kind of been an off-the-cuff discussion here, so if you got a thought that you'd like to share.
Well, let me think. I know that I've seen it work in other countries. I just came back from the Philippines, and they're training their own men. The churches there are doing quite well in general. They're standing on their own 2 feet. I'm pleased to see that. The one church that I was mostly in has a number of men that they're training, and some of the ones that I've known there now for several years are now on staff, and they're being sent out on weekends to go and fill pulpits and in the mission works. And so I think they're doing it very well. They're teaching and giving them the practical experience at the same time. I was in Samoa, and there is men there that have surrendered to preach, and I was glad to go back after almost 2 years of being there and seeing them still there. That's always an encouragement. I think the devil is very much on the prowl to snatch up the young preachers, get them off track, get their eyes on the world or whatever it is, because that's really where the future is. We know it's the foolishness of preaching that saves souls, and it's being able to send out preachers that sees churches established and the Lord's work goes on beyond our time. And so that's the fear, is the great fear is protecting them, and really you can't do everything for them, so you can pray for them. And the more prayer that we can offer up on their behalf, I think that's the key.
Probably the most underrated, talked about, but underrated still.
Exactly.
Commodity. And
I think you see it with Paul, as he constantly said, I thank God every remembrance of you. And he wasn't just talking about how he remembered in his mind, but how he remembered him in prayer. And it's really just a total commitment on the part of the mentor, and a total commitment required of the mentoree for it to really to work.
Amen.
Thanks for listening. Your ministry does not have to stagnate or die. If you want to get out of the box and into the book, get some help right now. Give me a shout at pdhammett@gmail.com. We'll discuss what you need and recommend a course of action. Get in touch with me. You can also find tips, tools, and truths to advance eternal effectiveness in ministry and make an eternal impact at masterministry.com. Thanks for listening. Now let's go make a difference.